I hired a cleaning lady, while my son and his new wife were on a luxury vacation. An hour later, she called me in a sheer panic. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling, "there is someone crying in the attic, and they are scratching at the door." I drove straight there, took a sledgehammer to the biometric lock, and what I found hidden in the dark completely shattered my world. My blood did not just boil, it turned to ice. If you have ever trusted your family only to discover a monster wearing their face, hit the like button and subscribe to hear my story. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. My name is William Harrison, though most people in the Chicago real estate circuit just call me Bill. I am 75 years old, a self-made billionaire who spent 5 decades turning dirt and concrete into an empire. I did not inherit a single dime. Every skyscraper, every residential complex, every commercial block with my name on it was built with sweat, sleepless nights, and a ruthless determination to provide my family with a life of absolute security. It was a rainy Tuesday morning, and I was sitting in my downtown Chicago penthouse, quietly reviewing a stack of architectural blueprints for a new development project. The city stretched out below me, a vast sea of glass and steel, completely oblivious to the personal nightmare that was about to unfold. I was looking forward to a peaceful week. My 40-year-old son Derek and his new wife Natalie had just flown out for a 2-week luxury vacation in the Maldives. They had been planning this trip for months, posting endless photos of crystal-clear water and overwater bungalows. Since they were going to be away, I did what any helpful father would do. I sent my trusted personal cleaner, a sweet, hard-working woman named Sarah Jenkins, up to their $3 million mansion in Winnetka to give the place a deep clean before they returned. I had bought that estate for Derek as a wedding gift when he married Natalie. I wanted them to have the perfect home, a sanctuary. I was just pouring myself a second cup of black coffee when my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah's name. I answered, expecting her to ask a simple question about the alarm system or the thermostat. Instead, I heard the sound of heavy, rapid breathing. "Mr. Harrison." Sarah gasped. Her voice was shaking so violently I could barely understand her. "Sarah, slow down," I said, setting my coffee mug on the blueprints. "What is wrong? Are you hurt? Did the alarm go off?" "No, sir," she whispered, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "I am on the 2nd floor. I was just dusting the hallway near the attic stairs. Sir, there is someone up there." I frowned, my mind immediately jumping to logical conclusions. "Sarah, the house is supposed to be empty. It is probably just the television in the guest room left on, or maybe a raccoon got into the crawl space." "It is not a television, Mr. Harrison," she cried, her voice cracking with pure terror. "I swear to you, it is a person. Someone is crying." I heard muffled sobbing, and then they started scratching at the door from the inside. It sounded like fingernails dragging against the metal. I am so scared. Should I call the police? A cold chill washed over my chest. I knew that house inside and out. I had personally walked through every inch of it before signing the $3 million check. The attic door was not a standard wooden panel. Derek had recently installed a heavy steel reinforced door with a high-tech biometric fingerprint lock. When I had asked him about it a few months ago, he casually brushed it off. He told me it was Natalie's designated storage room for her expensive winter furs and a bunch of harsh, industrial cleaning chemicals she did not want accidentally spilling anywhere else in the house. The biometric lock, he claimed, was just for absolute safety. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice dropping into that firm, authoritative tone I usually reserved for boardroom negotiations. "Do not call the police yet. Do not make a sound. Go straight downstairs, walk out the front door, lock it behind you, and wait for me in your car. Do you understand? I am on my way right now." I hung up the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed my keys, threw on my coat, and took the private elevator down to the parking garage. As I merged my Cadillac onto the Interstate 94, pushing the engine well past the speed limit, my mind raced through 1,000 terrifying possibilities. Why would someone be locked in an attic with a biometric lock? Why would they be crying and scratching at the door? Derek and Natalie were thousands of miles away, sipping champagne on a tropical island. The security system on that house was state-of-the-art. Nobody could just break in and lock themselves in an attic. The only people with access to that specific door were my son and his wife. The rain beat violently against my windshield as I weaved through the heavy Chicago traffic. Memories flashed through my mind. I thought about my late daughter-in-law, Derek's first wife, who passed away tragically when their son Leo was just a little boy. I loved that boy more than life itself. Leo was 16 years old now, a brilliant but sensitive kid. According to Derek, Leo had been struggling with severe behavioral issues, so they had sent him to an elite, extremely private boarding school in Switzerland. I had been wiring $150,000 a year directly to a specific educational fund managed by Derek to cover the tuition. I had not seen my grandson in person for almost 3 years. Every time I asked to visit him, Derek and Natalie always had a convenient excuse. The school was too strict, visitors disrupted his routine, or Leo was simply on a school trip across Europe. I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned white. My breathing grew shallow. A horrific, unspeakable suspicion began to claw at the edges of my mind, but I forced it down. No, I told myself. Derek is my son. He might be arrogant, he might be materialistic, but he is absolutely not a monster. It took me 40 minutes to reach the affluent, quiet streets of Winnetka. The neighborhood was perfectly manicured. A stark contrast to the storm raging inside my head. I pulled into the sweeping driveway of the mansion and slammed the car into park. Sarah was waiting in her small sedan near the gates, looking pale and completely terrified. I stepped out into the heavy rain and walked over to her window. "Stay here, Sarah," I ordered firmly. "Lock your doors." I unlocked the front door using my emergency keypad code and stepped into the silent, luxurious foyer. The house was immaculate, smelling of expensive candles and fresh linens. It felt entirely normal, which somehow made the situation even more deeply disturbing. I bypassed the grand staircase and headed straight for the garage first. I knew I needed a heavy tool. I found a massive 10-pound steel sledgehammer sitting on the workbench. I gripped the wooden handle, feeling the rough texture against my palms, and walked back inside, making my way up to the second floor. The hallway was perfectly still. At the very end, tucked away in the shadows, was the reinforced steel door leading to the attic. I stood silently in front of it, holding my breath, pressing my ear close to the cold metal surface. For a long moment there was absolutely nothing, and then I heard it, a soft, desperate whimper. It was a weak, agonizing sound, followed by the faint, desperate scraping of fingernails against the steel frame. It was a sound that completely bypassed my logical brain and struck directly at my soul. "Hello," I called out, my voice booming through the empty hallway. "Is someone in there?" The scratching immediately stopped. The crying went dead silent. Whoever was inside was utterly terrified of being heard. I did not wait another second. I raised the heavy sledgehammer high over my shoulder. With every ounce of strength left in my 75-year-old body, fueled by pure adrenaline and rising panic, I swung the hammer directly into the biometric scanner. The plastic and glass shattered instantly. I swung again, aiming for the locking mechanism. The sound of metal crashing against metal echoed through the massive house like a gunshot. I hit the door a third time, feeling the violent vibration rattle through my bones. The lock finally gave way with a sharp, echoing crack. I dropped the sledgehammer, grabbed the handle, and shoved the heavy door open. I was entirely unprepared for the horrifying nightmare I was about to discover waiting for me in the dark. I stood there, in the dead silence of the second-floor hallway, gripping the wooden handle of the sledgehammer so tightly my hands began to cramp. The crying inside that attic had stopped the exact moment I shouted. That abrupt silence was somehow far more terrifying than the weeping had been. It was the silence of a cornered animal. The silence of someone who had been conditioned to fear the sound of a human voice. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady the violent shaking in my chest. I swung the 10-pound steel sledgehammer back over my right shoulder. The heavy metal head came crashing down onto the sleek black glass of the biometric scanner. The plastic shattered into sharp pieces, raining onto the floor. A harsh electronic beep pierced the air as the security panel short-circuited. I did not stop. I pulled the hammer back and drove it directly into the steel locking mechanism. The impact sent a painful shockwave straight up my arms, vibrating deep into my shoulders, but the deadbolt splintered and gave way with a loud metallic crunch. I dropped the heavy tool, grabbed the brass handle, and threw my entire body weight against the door. It swung open, hitting the inner wall with a heavy thud. The moment the seal was broken, a wave of stagnant, suffocating air hit me straight in the face. I gagged instinctively, bringing my arm up to cover my nose and mouth. The room reeked of harsh ammonia chemical disinfectants and the unmistakable sour stench of unwashed bodies and human waste. My eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom. The attic was massive, but the windows had been completely boarded up and covered with thick acoustic soundproofing foam. A single dim yellow bulb dangled from the exposed wooden rafters, casting long, distorted shadows across the dust-covered floor. I stepped carefully over a shattered ceramic bowl that looked like a dog's water dish. The walls were lined with thick gray acoustic foam. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed sections near the bottom, where the foam had been violently torn away by desperate, bloody fingernails. The sheer psychological torture of being trapped in this sensory deprivation chamber was unimaginable. The floorboards were stained and rotting in the corners, reeking of profound neglect. There were no books, no blankets, no basic human comforts of any kind. Just raw, exposed structural beams and the oppressive, heavy smell of decay. I vividly remembered buying this house, standing in this very space when it was just an empty, dusty storage room, envisioning a happy, growing family, filling the beautiful floors below. To see it transformed into a black site, a domestic torture chamber built by my own flesh and blood for his own child, made my vision blur with hot tears of blinding, uncontrollable rage. My breathing became ragged as I scanned the room for any sign of life. My gaze swept the room, searching through the piles of cardboard boxes and old furniture. Then I saw him. Tucked away in the furthest, darkest corner of the room, sitting on a thin, stained mattress on the floor, was a boy. He had his knees pulled tightly to his chest, his arms wrapped around his head in a defensive posture. He was shivering violently, completely unresponsive to the sudden light and noise of my intrusion. I took a slow, cautious step forward, my dress shoes crunching against the scattered debris on the floor. I squinted through the gloom, trying to make sense of the horrific scene. As I got closer, the dim light finally caught his face, and the last shred of my reality completely collapsed. It was Leo. It was my grandson. The boy sitting on that filthy mattress was a ghost of the vibrant, athletic teenager I remembered. His skin was practically translucent, stretched tightly over his cheekbones. His thick, dark hair was matted and overgrown, falling into his sunken, hollow eyes. He looked severely emaciated, as if he had not eaten a proper meal in months. But it was not just his physical deterioration that made my blood run cold. It was the thick, heavy steel chain wrapped securely around his left ankle. The metal links snaked across the wooden floorboards, firmly padlocked to the base of a cast-iron radiator bolted securely into the wall. I remembered the last time I saw him 3 years ago at my penthouse. He was 13, full of bright energy and endless questions about architecture and real estate. He wanted to build skyscrapers just like his grandfather. He had a brilliant mind and a gentle spirit, inheriting all the best qualities from his late mother. We had spent hours looking over blueprints together, mapping out his future. He was supposed to be touring prestigious universities right now, preparing to take the world by storm. Instead, he was reduced to a chained prisoner, stripped of his dignity, his youth, and his mind. My eyes darted around his makeshift prison cell. Sitting on a small plastic table just inches from his reach was an automated electronic pill dispenser. It was a heavy-duty medical device, the kind used in psychiatric wards to regulate strict dosages. The small digital screen on the front was flashing a bright red error code. The internal rotating tray was jammed, trapping a handful of small white pills behind a layer of thick, unbreakable plastic. Leo was staring at that machine with an empty, hollow desperation that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. He was not looking at me. He was completely fixated on the locked medication. My mind reeled, violently rejecting what my eyes were seeing. This made absolutely no sense. For the past 3 years, my son Derek had been sending me glowing updates about Leo's progress at a highly exclusive private boarding school nestled in the mountains of Switzerland. I had been personally financing that education. Every single August, I wired $150,000 directly into an educational trust fund that Derek managed. I had paid for ski trips, language tutors, and prestigious European excursions. Derek had sent me carefully cropped photos of Leo standing in front of snow-covered mountains and historic school buildings. He had fed me a steady diet of elaborate lies, while my flesh and blood was chained to a radiator in a toxic, soundproofed attic just an hour away from my own home. Leo, I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of the horror. I dropped to my knees beside the filthy mattress, reaching out a trembling hand to touch his frail shoulder. It is me. It is your grandfather. I am here. You are safe now. The moment my fingers brushed against his thin shirt, Leo let out a blood-curdling, agonizing scream that echoed off the soundproofed walls. He violently recoiled, throwing himself against the wall. His entire body began to convulse with terrifying intensity. He grabbed his own hair, pulling at the roots, his eyes rolling back in his head. The withdrawal hit him like a freight train. He gasped for air, his chest heaving as he clawed desperately at his own throat. It was not a panic attack. It was a severe, life-threatening physical reaction to a chemical deprivation. He was going into shock right in front of my eyes. I grabbed his shaking shoulders, trying to stabilize him, trying to prevent him from slamming his head against the hard floor. My hands were covered in his cold, clammy sweat. As I held my dying grandson, the final sickening piece of the puzzle snapped into place. I installed the multi-million-dollar security system for this mansion myself. I knew exactly how it worked. It recorded every single door opening, every window breach, every perimeter alarm. There were 0 security breaches in the last 3 years. No one had broken into this house to kidnap my grandson. No stranger had sneaked in to lock him in the attic. There was only one person who had the biometric fingerprint authorization to lock that heavy steel door. There was only one person who controlled the Swiss tuition funds. My son. My own flesh and blood had done this to his child. I did not have time to process the monumental betrayal. My immediate priority was keeping my grandson alive. I scooped Leo into my arms. He was dangerously light, his bones sharp against my chest, feeling no heavier than a child half his age. I carried him down the grand staircase of that $3 million mansion, ignoring the cold rain that soaked us as I carefully placed him into the back seat of my Cadillac. Sarah was still waiting in her vehicle, her face pale with absolute terror. I rolled down my window and instructed her to go home immediately. I promised her I would handle everything, and that she would be generously compensated for her absolute silence. I could not risk a public spectacle. If I called a standard ambulance, the local police would inevitably follow. Within an hour, the Chicago tabloids would be running headlines about the billionaire real estate tycoon, whose family was running a dungeon in the wealthy suburbs. I needed absolute discretion. I sped toward a highly exclusive, private medical clinic located on the outskirts of the city. It was a very secluded facility I heavily funded through my philanthropic foundation for many long years. The doctors there were bound by strict non-disclosure agreements and understood the delicate nature of handling high-profile patients. I carried Leo through the pristine glass doors of the emergency entrance, demanding immediate medical attention. The medical team immediately swarmed us, taking him from my arms and placing him onto a rolling gurney. They rushed him down the sterile, blindingly white corridor, barking out medical terms and preparing intravenous drips, I stood alone in the hallway, my chest heaving, my expensive suit stained with sweat and grime from the attic floor. The heavy scent of the clinic grounded me. A potent mix of rubbing alcohol and bleached cotton pulled me back into reality. I paced the floor of the private waiting room for what felt like an eternity. Every passing minute felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. Finally, the lead physician, a trusted man named Dr. Evans, emerged from the treatment room. He looked remarkably grave. He explained that Leo was suffering from severe chemical withdrawal and required immediate aggressive intervention to save his life. They had to administer powerful counteracting agents to stabilize his dangerously high heart rate and prevent permanent neurological damage entirely. Dr. Evans assured me that the boy would survive, but he was currently unconscious and required round-the-clock medical supervision. I thanked the doctor and walked quietly into Leo's private room. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. My grandson looked so small and fragile in that massive hospital bed, tangled in a web of intravenous tubes and monitoring wires. Looking at his pale, sunken face, the initial shock I felt in the attic rapidly hardened into a cold, calculated fury. My own son had completely orchestrated this horrific nightmare alone. He had smiled in my face, accepted my money, and built a torture chamber in his own home. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. My hands were no longer shaking. They were perfectly steady. I checked the current time in the Maldives. It was early evening over there, the perfect time for a tropical dinner on the beach. I opened my contact list and initiated a video call to Derek. The phone rang 3 times before the connection was established. The screen illuminated, displaying a picturesque, breathtaking background. I could see the crystal-clear turquoise ocean glowing beautifully. The water sparkled under a vibrant orange sunset. Derek was sitting on a plush lounge chair on the private deck of an overwater bungalow. He was wearing a crisp linen shirt, his skin tanned, holding a tall crystal glass filled with a colorful cocktail. He looked the very picture of wealth, relaxation, and carefree happiness. The sickening contrast between his luxurious paradise and the terrifying reality of Leo's hospital room was incredibly jarring. It made my stomach churn with pure disgust. Dad Derek smiled warmly, raising his glass toward the camera. "This is a very nice surprise for us both. We were just getting ready to head down to the beach for a private dinner. Natalie is inside getting dressed right now. Is everything all right in Chicago?" I did not smile back. I did not exchange any pleasantries. I simply stared at the screen, letting the silence stretch until Derek's relaxed smile began to falter. The confusion slowly crept into his eyes as he noticed my grim expression and the harsh fluorescent lighting illuminating my face. "Derek," I said, my voice low, dangerously calm, and completely devoid of any paternal affection. "I am going to show you something right now. I want you to look at it very carefully and tell me what you see." I switched the view from my face to the hospital bed. I stepped back so the wide-angle lens could capture the entire scene. I made sure Derek could clearly see the medical machinery, the tangled wires, and the frail, unconscious body of his teenage son lying motionless under the thin white sheets. I held the camera perfectly steady for 10 excruciating seconds, forcing him to absorb the undeniable reality of his actions. I could hear his breath hitch through the speaker of the phone. The sound of the gentle ocean waves in the background of his call was entirely eclipsed by the mechanical beeping of Leo's heart monitor. I flipped the camera back to my face. "I am standing in a private medical clinic," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. "I just took a sledgehammer to the biometric lock on your attic door. I found my grandson chained to a radiator like an animal. He is starving and suffering from severe chemical withdrawal. I have exactly 60 seconds before I dial the direct number for the Federal Bureau of Investigation locally. You have until that clock runs out to tell me the absolute truth." I waited for the denial. I expected him to feign ignorance, to blame the missing cleaner, to spin some elaborate tale about a home invasion or a tragic misunderstanding. I braced myself for the arrogance and the lies I had unknowingly tolerated for the last 3 years. Instead, the color completely drained from Derek's tanned face. He dropped his expensive cocktail. The heavy crystal glass shattered against the wooden deck of his bungalow, splashing liquor everywhere. He did not reach down to clean it up at all. He grabbed his phone with both hands, bringing the screen dangerously close to his face. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. "Dad." "Wait, please, do not call the police," Derek choked out, his voice cracking violently. The smooth, confident demeanor of the successful real estate heir vanished instantly. He completely broke down, bursting into hysterical, convincing tears right there on the screen. "Please, you do not understand the whole story. If you involve the authorities, they will lock him away in a federal facility forever. He will never survive it. I beg you, let me explain everything today." I watched the color drain from my son's face through the screen of my phone. The tropical breeze of the Maldives seemed to freeze around him as he stared at the horrifying image of his own son unconscious in a sterile hospital bed. I had just given him 60 seconds to tell me the truth before I called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a moment, Derek simply gasped for air, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Then the arrogant, polished facade of the real estate heir I had raised completely shattered. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently as he let out a loud, agonizing sob that echoed through the speaker. "Dad, please, you have to listen to me," Derek pleaded, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine, desperate panic. "I am begging you, do not make that phone call. If you call the authorities, they will lock him up in a high-security juvenile prison, and he will never survive it. You do not know what has been happening. We have been living in a waking nightmare for the last 2 years." I kept my expression perfectly rigid, forcing my voice to remain as cold as the winter wind coming off Lake Michigan. "You have 50 seconds, Derek. Start talking. Explain to me why my grandson is chained to a radiator like a rabid animal while you sip cocktails on a private beach." Derek wiped his face, his chest heaving as he stared directly into the camera. "He is not a prisoner, Dad. He is a severe addict. 2 years ago, the headmaster of the Swiss boarding school called me in the middle of the night. Leo was not just caught smoking marijuana or drinking alcohol. He had gotten himself deeply involved with a European drug cartel that operated out of Zurich. He owed them a massive amount of money. They found highly addictive, synthetic opioids hidden inside his dormitory mattress. The school was going to hand him over to the Swiss authorities immediately. I listened in stony silence as my son spun his masterful web of lies. His delivery was flawless. The tremor in his voice, the widened eyes, the absolute terror of a father trying to save his child. If I had not seen the toxic, soundproofed dungeon with my own eyes, I might have actually believed him. "I paid the school board a fortune to keep the police out of it." Derek continued his words, rushing out in a frantic stream. "I brought him back to Chicago under the radar. I thought I could fix him, Dad. I thought if I just brought him home and loved him, he would recover. But the drugs had altered his brain chemistry. He became severely psychotic and entirely unpredictable. He started having violent, terrifying outbursts. He destroyed his bedroom, smashed the windows, and threatened the household staff. We had to fire everyone to keep his condition a secret." As Derek spoke, the bedroom door of his overwater bungalow opened. Natalie stepped out onto the wooden deck. She was wearing an emerald green silk evening gown, her hair perfectly styled for a romantic dinner. When she saw Derek sobbing into the phone, her initial irritation quickly shifted into performative panic. She rushed over, dropping to her knees beside his lounge chair, pulling his arm. Derek turned the screen slightly so she could see the hospital bed, where Leo lay completely motionless. Natalie gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her manicured hands. She immediately began to weep, tears streaming down her carefully painted cheeks. "Oh my God, Bill," she cried, staring at the camera with wide, terrified eyes. Please, you have to understand the hell we have been going through. We have been trying to save his life. If you were trying to save his life. I interrupted, my voice sharp and cutting. You would have put him in a professional medical rehabilitation center. You would not have chained his ankle to a metal pipe in a soundproofed attic with a jammed automated pill dispenser. Natalie shook her head vigorously, leaning closer to the microphone. We tried to get him professional help, Bill, we really did. But every single rehabilitation center told us they would have to report his violent tendencies and his drug connections to the local police. We could not let him go to prison. 3 months ago, his withdrawals became so severe that he grabbed a kitchen knife and cornered me in the hallway. He tried to kill me, Bill. He did not even know who I was. His eyes were completely dead. We were utterly terrified of him, but we could not bear to throw him to the criminal justice system. Derek wrapped his arm around Natalie, comforting her as she sobbed into his shoulder. The performance was sickeningly coordinated. I found an underground private doctor who deals with high-profile discrete addiction cases, Derek explained, wiping his own tears. That doctor prescribed the automated pill dispenser. It was the only way to safely administer the heavy counteracting sedatives without putting ourselves in immediate physical danger. The chains were just to keep him from hurting himself or destroying the house during his violent night terrors. It was for his own safety, Dad. We had to keep him restrained so he would not run away and buy more drugs on the street. I stared at the two of them through the digital screen, feeling a heavy toxic knot twisting deep in my stomach. The level of manipulation was genuinely staggering. They were painting themselves as dedicated, self-sacrificing parents who were forced to make impossible, heartbreaking decisions to protect their severely troubled child. And what about this vacation, I asked, refusing to let my anger show. You leave a suicidal teenager locked in a cage while you fly across the world to a luxury resort. We did not leave him alone, Natalie cried defensively, wiping her nose. We hired a highly specialized private nurse to stay in the house and monitor the dispenser 24 hours a day. We paid her an absolute fortune in cash to guarantee her complete silence. We just needed 1 week of peace, Bill. Just 1 week to breathe and remember how to be a married couple after 2 years of living in a domestic war zone. That nurse must have stolen our money and abandoned her post. I swear to you, we would never leave him to die. Derek leaned directly into the camera lens, his face twisted in a mask of agonizing desperation. Dad, look at me. I know how horrible this looks from the outside. I know it looks like abuse, but every single thing I have done has been to protect Leo's future. If you make that phone call to the authorities, everything I have sacrificed to keep him out of a jail cell will be destroyed. They will lock him away in a cold concrete box with violent criminals, and his life will be over forever. You have to let us handle our son, Dad. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Do not call the police. I stared at the screen, watching the man I raised reduce himself to a weeping, trembling mess. Part of me wanted to end the call, dial the authorities, hand over the evidence, and let the justice system tear my son apart. But another part of me, the aging father, who remembered carrying Derek on my shoulders, hesitated. I pictured the vicious tabloid headlines, the paparazzi swarming our properties, and the total destruction of our family legacy. More importantly, I thought about Leo. If Derek was telling the truth about the Swiss cartel and the synthetic opioid addiction involving the federal authorities would guarantee my grandson would be thrown into a high-security juvenile detention center. I had spent my entire life accumulating wealth specifically to protect my family from the unforgiving brutality of the world. Throwing Leo to the wolves of the justice system felt like a profound betrayal of everything I had worked for. Stop crying, I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy tension. I do not want to hear another excuse, Derek. I do not want to hear another word about the sacrifices you think you have made. You are going to listen to me, and you are going to do exactly what I say, or I will make that phone call and ruin your life forever. Do you understand me? Derek nodded frantically on the screen, wiping his tear-stained face. Yes, Dad. I understand. Just tell me what to do, whatever you want. Your vacation is over, I stated coldly. I do not care how much money you spent on that overwater bungalow. You and Natalie are going to pack your bags right now. You are going to take the next available flight out of the Maldives and come straight back to Chicago. You will return immediately. We will leave tonight. Natalie interjected quickly, her face pale as she leaned into the frame. We will book a private charter if we have to. We will be there as soon as possible, Bill. I promise you. Do not make promises to me, Natalie, I warned her. My patience is completely exhausted. Furthermore, Leo is no longer your responsibility. When the doctors finally clear him for discharge, I am taking him directly to my downtown penthouse. I have a dedicated professional security team and enough space for full-time medical staff. He will remain in my absolute custody until I decide otherwise. Derek opened his mouth, a flash of defensive panic crossing his face. But Dad, his condition is completely unpredictable. You do not know how dangerous he can be when the withdrawals hit. He needs specialized restraints. He needs the automated dispenser. You cannot just keep him in a regular bedroom. Do not presume to lecture me about safety, Derek, I snapped. I will hire highly trained addiction specialists. I will hire private security guards to stand outside his door 24 hours a day. He will receive legitimate, compassionate medical care, not the barbaric torture you subjected him to. If you ever try to take him from me without my explicit permission, I will destroy you. I terminated the video call. The screen went completely dark, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence of the clinical hallway. My chest ached with a profound, overwhelming sorrow. I wanted to believe that I had just made the right decision. I told myself that a desperate, terrified father might actually do crazy, unthinkable things to save an addicted son from prison or a fatal overdose. Perhaps Derek truly believed he was protecting the boy. Yet despite my desperate attempts to find a reasonable explanation, a dark, unsettling seed of doubt remained firmly planted in my mind. It just did not add up. If Leo was truly a violent danger to himself and others, why not hire professional, discreet addiction counselors to live in the house? I had given Derek more than enough money to afford the best private care in the country. Why chain the boy to a heavy iron radiator in absolute darkness? Why lock the door with a biometric fingerprint scanner that was a calculated, deliberate imprisonment? A few hours later, Dr. Evans finally emerged from the intensive care unit. He looked deeply fatigued, but offered me a reassuring, gentle smile. He informed me that the counteracting medications had successfully stabilized Leo's dangerously erratic heart rate. The severe tremors had finally subsided, and the boy was resting peacefully under the influence of safe, carefully monitored sedatives. Dr. Evans agreed that moving Leo to my secure penthouse with a round-the-clock private medical team was the best possible course of action for his delicate recovery. I arranged for a discreet private medical transport vehicle to carefully move my grandson to my downtown residence. By the time we arrived at the penthouse, the sun had already set. I instructed the medical team to gently settle Leo into the large, comfortable guest suite at the end of the main hallway. Once the doctors and nurses had finished setting up the vital sign monitors and intravenous fluids, they quietly withdrew to the adjoining sitting room to give us some privacy. I pulled a heavy leather armchair right up to the edge of the large bed and sat down. I watched the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of Leo's chest. He looked so incredibly peaceful now, completely stripped of the agonizing pain and sheer terror I had witnessed in that horrible attic. The luxurious high-thread couch sheets were a stark contrast to the filthy, stained mattress he had been forced to sleep on. I reached out and gently brushed a lock of dark matted hair away from his pale forehead. I silently promised him that I would uncover the absolute truth no matter where the evidence led, and that I would never let anyone hurt him again. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed softly, marking the arrival of midnight. I was just about to stand up and get myself a glass of water when Leo suddenly shifted in the bed. His breathing hitched, growing shallow and rapid. His brow furrowed in deep distress, as if he were trapped in a terrifying nightmare. He tossed his head from side to side, his hands curling tightly into fists by his sides. I leaned closer, resting my hand gently over his to calm him. "It is all right, Leo," I whispered softly. "You are safe now. You are with your grandfather." His eyes remained tightly closed, but his pale lips parted. He let out a weak, agonizing whimper that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then, in a fragile, broken voice that barely registered above a whisper, he mumbled a sentence that completely shattered the foundation of my son's elaborate story. "Do not make me sign it, Natalie," Leo whimpered in his sleep, his voice shaking with sheer, unadulterated terror. "Please, I do not want the money. Just tell my dad I did not take the pills. I never touched them. I am telling the absolute truth to you now. Please stop making me swallow them." Those fragile, terrified words hung in the quiet air of the guest suite, chilling me to the very marrow of my bones. Please stop making me swallow them. I stared down at my grandson, my hand still resting gently over his. He was not talking about a violent Swiss drug cartel. He was not mumbling about owing money to dangerous criminals in Zurich. In his most vulnerable unconscious state, the monster hunting him in his nightmares was his own stepmother. I slowly withdrew my hand, leaning back into the heavy leather armchair, as a profound, sickening wave of realization washed over me. The elaborate, tearful story Derek had spun for me on the video call just hours ago was rapidly beginning to unravel before my very eyes today. I sat perfectly still in the dim light of the bedroom, listening to the steady rhythm of the heart monitor, while my mind raced through the implications. If Leo was a violent addict undergoing a desperate domestic rehabilitation, he would be begging for his drugs. He would be fighting the restraints to get his next fix. Instead, he was begging someone to stop forcing pills down his throat. The automated, heavily jammed dispenser I had found next to his filthy mattress in the attic was not a tool for a safe detox. It was a mechanism of forced compliance. I stayed awake for the entire night watching over him, turning every detail of the last 3 years over and over in my head. As the first pale rays of morning sunlight began to filter through the sheer curtains of the penthouse windows, the heavy oak door of the suite softly clicked open. It was Dr. Evans. He looked exhausted, having spent the entire night running comprehensive laboratory diagnostics at his private clinic. He carried a thick manila folder tucked under his arm, and his usually composed professional demeanor was replaced by a deeply troubled frown. He gestured silently for me to follow him out of the room. I quietly pushed myself out of the armchair, ensuring Leo was still sleeping soundly, before I stepped out into the expansive, marble-floored hallway and closed the door firmly behind me. Dr. Evans did not speak immediately. He walked a few paces down the corridor, distancing us completely from the guest suite, before he turned to face me. He opened the manila folder, pulling out a stack of medical charts covered in complex chemical breakdowns and numerical graphs. "Bill," he began, his voice lowered to a serious, confidential whisper. "I expedited the comprehensive toxicology screening. We ran his blood and urine through every single panel we have. We tested for everything your son claimed the boy was addicted to." I braced myself, expecting to hear a laundry list of illegal narcotics. "What did you find?" I asked, keeping my tone completely steady, despite the furious pounding of my heart. Dr. Evans looked up from the papers, meeting my gaze with absolute certainty. "Nothing," he stated. "I found absolutely nothing that aligns with a history of recreational drug abuse. There are 0 traces of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, or any synthetic opioids in his system. His liver and kidney functions show no signs of long-term narcotic processing. The boy is not a drug addict, Bill. He never was." I stared at the doctor, my mind struggling to process the monumental weight of his words. "Are you absolutely certain?" I asked, needing absolute confirmation. "Derek explicitly told me that Leo was heavily involved with a cartel. He said the boy was caught with massive quantities of drugs in his dormitory." "I am a medical professional, Bill, not an investigator," Dr. Evans replied firmly. "I cannot tell you what happened in Switzerland, but I can tell you what is written in his blood right now." I ran the screening 3 separate times to be completely sure. There are no street drugs in his body. However, that does not mean his system is clean. In fact, what we did find is profoundly disturbing. Dr. Evans flipped to the second page of the medical report, tapping his pen against a highlighted section of the chemical breakdown. His blood is completely saturated with exceptionally high levels of benzodiazepines. He explained, his tone laced with genuine medical concern. Specifically, a highly potent clinical-grade sedative, usually reserved for extreme psychiatric emergencies. It is a central nervous system depressant, designed to slow brain activity, induce deep sleep, and suppress physical coordination. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. I looked at the complicated medical charts, the stark printed numbers confirming the horrifying reality of my grandson's torment. "Why would someone give this to a teenager?" I asked, my voice barely more than a rough whisper. "You do not use this class of medication to safely detox an addict," Dr. Evans explained, closing the folder with a sharp, definitive snap. "If a patient is withdrawing from opioids, we use specific weaning agents to manage the physical symptoms. We do not flood their brain with heavy tranquilizers." The dosage we found in Leo's bloodstream is astronomical. If administered consistently over a long period of time, it would induce a state of permanent lethargy. It strips away a person's free will, destroys their short-term memory, and makes them entirely compliant. In the medical field, we call it a chemical lobotomy. Whoever has been giving him these pills was intentionally trying to keep him unconscious and completely disconnected from reality. Dr. Evans pulled out a secondary chart from the manila folder, pointing a pen at a series of complex brain scans they had rushed through the MRI machine. "Look at this bill," he said, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed professional outrage. The prolonged, continuous exposure to these astronomical levels of clinical sedatives does not just put him to sleep. It actively and aggressively deteriorates the delicate neural pathways responsible for critical thinking, emotional regulation, and short-term memory retention. It is a medical miracle he could even form a coherent sentence in his sleep last night. Furthermore, his stomach lining is severely inflamed from a complete lack of solid, nutritious food, and his overall muscle mass has atrophied to a critical, dangerous level due to the heavy chains restricting his physical movement. I stared at the scans, the stark black and white images representing the systematic, deliberate destruction of my grandson's brilliant mind. He had been a state chess champion at age 12, a boy who could solve complex architectural equations in his head. Derek had not just chained his body, he had actively waged a biochemical war against his own son's intellect. The cruelty was purely sadistic. The doctor's words echoed in the quiet hallway, ringing in my ears like a death knell. A chemical lobotomy. My own son was not fighting to save Leo from a dangerous addiction. He was deliberately, systematically erasing the boy's mind. The automated pill dispenser in the attic was never meant to deliver a controlled, safe detox program. It was a torture device programmed to continuously drug a healthy 16-year-old boy into a permanent state of zombified compliance. I thanked Dr. Evans for his absolute discretion and instructed him to continue providing Leo with whatever neutralizing treatments were necessary to flush the toxins from his body safely. Once the doctor stepped into the private elevator and the doors slid shut, I was left entirely alone in the sprawling silence of my penthouse. The morning sun was now pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the luxurious artwork and expensive furnishings of my home, but I had never felt so surrounded by pure darkness. I walked slowly over to the large, clear glass windows of my enormous bedroom, looking out over the busy waking city of Chicago. My breathing was slow, deep, and measured. The intricate web of lies Derek had so carefully constructed was completely collapsing under the weight of undeniable scientific evidence. My grandson had never been a violent drug addict. He had been a prisoner poisoned daily by his own family. The question burned fiercely in my chest, a terrifying mystery demanding an immediate answer today. If Leo was not an addict at all, why on earth was Derek intentionally drugging his own flesh and blood son into a deep, permanent, silent coma? I took the medical file from Dr. Evans, feeling the heavy, glossy paper tremble slightly between my fingers. The sheer magnitude of Derek's deception was almost impossible to fully comprehend. He had not just lied to me about Switzerland. He had actively manufactured a complex, terrifying fictional reality to justify locking his own son in a heavily soundproofed cage. I carefully placed the folder into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket, making sure the vital evidence was secure. The first rays of morning sunlight were beginning to aggressively cut through the expansive glass of my penthouse windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished hardwood floors. I needed cold, hard facts. I needed to meticulously follow the money. Over the past 3 years, I had transferred a total of $450,000 into the specific educational trust fund Derek had set up for Leo's supposed tuition. It was a substantial amount of money, but relative to my overall net worth. It was a negligible expense to ensure my grandson received the best possible care and education in the world. Now, however, every single dollar felt like a crucial piece of a dark, twisted puzzle that I urgently needed to solve. I walked briskly into my private study, a quiet oak-paneled room overlooking the bustling Chicago skyline. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk and fired up my secure encrypted laptop. I bypassed the standard banking portals and logged directly into the high-level private wealth management terminal reserved for my tier of accounts. Because I was the primary benefactor and the sole source of the funds flowing into that specific trust, my legal team had structured the account so that I retained full, unrestricted auditing privileges. Derek could authorize the disbursements, but he could not hide where the money ultimately landed. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up the comprehensive transaction history for the educational trust over the last 36 months. I pulled up the first major wire transfer I had authorized, a $50,000 deposit intended for Leo's initial semester at the Swiss Academy. The screen loaded instantly, displaying a dense wall of financial data. I traced the routing number. The funds had indeed cleared the trust account, but they had absolutely not been wired to any European financial institution. Instead, the money had been cleanly transferred to a domestic limited liability company registered right here in Illinois. The LLC was named Evergreen Consulting Services. I frowned, opening a new secure tab and running a quick corporate registry search on the company name. Within seconds, the official state records populated on my screen. The registered agent and sole managing director of Evergreen Consulting Services was listed as Natalie Brooks. It was my daughter-in-law's maiden name. A cold, bitter anger began to steadily burn in my chest. I started cross-referencing every single tuition payment I had ever made against the domestic LLC's banking activity. The pattern was incredibly consistent and utterly damning. Every time I wired a $50,000 installment for Leo's imaginary education, that exact amount was funneled directly into Natalie's personal slush fund within 48 hours. I dug deeper, pulling the expense reports for the LLC itself to see exactly how my grandson's tuition was actually being utilized. The results were completely nauseating. The money was not being hoarded in a secret offshore account or invested in legitimate assets. It was being rapidly liquidated to fund an outrageously lavish lifestyle. There were massive recurring charges at high-end luxury car dealerships, perfectly matching the payments for the 2 matching custom-ordered Porsche sports cars Derek and Natalie proudly kept in their multi-million-dollar garage. There were astronomical 5-figure receipts from exclusive jewelers downtown, frequent charges from elite private aviation charter companies, and finally the massive upfront payment for the luxury overwater bungalow in the Maldives, where they were currently vacationing. I sat back in my leather chair, letting out a slow, ragged breath. They were not trying to save Leo from a violent cartel. They were not desperately fighting to keep an addicted teenager out of a maximum security prison. They were systematically using his imaginary tuition as a personal, bottomless slush fund to finance a lifestyle far beyond what Derek's generous allowance could normally support. They had locked a healthy 16-year-old boy in a dark, toxic attic and chemically lobotomized him simply to justify stealing $450,000 from me. But the mathematics of their crime immediately struck me as deeply flawed. My mind, conditioned by 50 years of ruthless real estate negotiation and corporate strategy, recognized the glaring inconsistency in their plan. Yes, $450,000 was a significant amount of stolen money. But Derek was my only living child. He already lived in a $3 million mansion that I had paid for in cash. He drove cars I subsidized and took vacations I indirectly funded. Why risk multiple severe federal kidnapping and child abuse charges just to steal a few $100,000 over 3 years? If they just wanted the tuition money, they could have simply sent Leo to a cheap average public school in a different state and pocketed the massive difference without ever laying a hand on him. Why go through the terrifying trouble of hiring an underground doctor, purchasing heavy-duty psychiatric equipment, and chaining a boy to a metal pipe? The sheer cruelty of the physical imprisonment did not match the relatively low financial reward of the stolen tuition. There had to be a much larger, far more sinister financial motive at play, something absolutely massive that I was completely blind to. I closed my laptop, the burning anger inside me rapidly sharpening into cold, calculated focus. The sudden realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The tuition theft was not the main operation. It was merely a convenient side hustle, a way to cover their tracks while they kept Leo hidden from the world. I needed to understand the true scale of their deception before they returned to Chicago. I needed to know exactly what they were waiting for. I picked up my cell phone, bypassing my regular corporate contacts, and directly dialed the private unlisted number of Thomas Wright, the most aggressive, ruthless attorney I kept on permanent retainer. Thomas was not just a lawyer. He was a shark who specialized in unearthing buried financial secrets and destroying corporate adversaries. I told him to cancel all his morning appointments and get to my penthouse immediately. I was about to declare absolute war on my own family, but first I needed to figure out exactly why my son was willing to torture his own child. I sat alone in the cavernous silence of my private study. The cold glow of the laptop screen cast long, harsh shadows across my face. The financial documents I had just unearthed were securely saved, meticulously encrypted, and locked away on an external drive. My mind, usually sharp and decisive, was still struggling to fully process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. My only son, the boy I had raised with every privilege and opportunity the world had to offer, was actively torturing his own child for financial gain. The realization was a heavy, suffocating weight on my chest. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Chicago skyline. I had spent 50 years conquering that concrete jungle, ruthlessly outmaneuvering corporate sharks and hostile competitors, yet I had completely failed to see the predator breeding inside my own family. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of my cell phone shattered the quiet atmosphere of the room. I glanced down at the sleek mahogany desk. The caller identification displayed Derek's name, accompanied by a picture of him smiling brightly on a golf course. My stomach churned with absolute revulsion. I took a slow, deep breath, consciously slowing my racing heart. I needed to suppress the burning fury threatening to consume me. In the world of high-stakes real estate negotiation, showing your hand prematurely is a fatal mistake. If you want to trap a dangerous animal, you cannot let it know it is being hunted. You have to make it feel entirely in control. I cleared my throat, forcing my vocal cords to relax, and carefully constructed the persona of an exhausted, overwhelmed, and completely gullible old man. I pressed the green button to accept the incoming video transmission. Derek appeared on the screen. The luxurious sun-drenched background of the Maldives had been replaced by the sterile, bustling interior of the first-class Emirates lounge at the Dubai International Airport. He looked noticeably frantic. His designer linen shirt was wrinkled, and his hair was uncharacteristically messy. Natalie was sitting right next to him, her eyes wide and nervously darting toward the camera lens. They were terrified. They knew I had physical custody of Leo, and they were undoubtedly terrified that I had brought in my own team of medical professionals to evaluate him. Dad Derek began immediately, his voice tight and breathless. "We are in Dubai, waiting for our connecting flight. We will be in Chicago in 14 hours. How is he? Is he okay? Please tell me you did not call the police yet." I let out a long, heavy, trembling sigh, slumping my shoulders forward to appear physically smaller and weaker. I rubbed my eyes with a shaking hand, making sure he could see the deep lines of exhaustion etched into my face. "Derek," I murmured, my voice intentionally raspy and fragile. "I am just so incredibly tired, son. This entire situation is tearing me apart." I saw Derek swallow hard, leaning closer to his phone. "What happened, Dad?" he asked cautiously, searching my face for any sign of suspicion. "You were absolutely right," I said, allowing a perfectly timed note of defeat to crack my voice. "I stayed by his bedside all night. He woke up a few hours ago, and it was terrifying. He acted completely crazy. He was thrashing around, screaming about things that made absolutely no sense, throwing medical equipment across the room. The doctors had to rush in and physically restrain him to keep him from hurting himself. I have never seen anything like it in my entire life. It broke my heart to see my grandson in such a violent, unhinged state. The physical transformation that washed over my son and my daughter-in-law was instantaneous and completely nauseating. The rigid, terrifying tension that had locked Derek's shoulders completely evaporated. I could literally see the massive wave of relief wash over him. Natalie let out a loud, exaggerated exhale, pressing her hand against her chest and closing her eyes as if thanking a higher power. They had bought the lie hook, line, and sinker. They genuinely believed that Leo's agonizing chemical withdrawal had manifested as the violent, psychotic episode they had warned me about. They believed their monstrous alibi was perfectly intact. "I told you," Dad Derek said, his voice instantly regaining its smooth, arrogant confidence. "I told you how dangerous he is when the withdrawals hit him. That is exactly why we had to lock the door. That is exactly why we needed the automated dispenser and the restraints. We were terrified of him, and we were just trying to manage an impossible situation without sending him to prison. I know it looked barbaric to you, but we were doing our absolute best to save his life." I nodded slowly, forcing myself to look down at my hands to hide the lethal, burning hatred blazing in my eyes. "I know, son," I whispered meekly. "I am so sorry I doubted you. I was just shocked by the chains. It was a terrifying thing for a grandfather to see. But after watching him tear that hospital room apart this morning, I finally understand what you have been dealing with. I cannot handle this alone, Derek. I am 75 years old, and my heart cannot take this kind of stress." "We are coming home, Dad." Natalie chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial, sugary, sweet sympathy. "You do not have to do this by yourself anymore. We are a family, and we will handle this terrible burden together. Just come straight to my penthouse the moment your flight lands in Chicago," I told them, maintaining the facade of a helpless elder, relying on his capable children. "I have moved him into the secure guest suite here. I hired private security to stand outside his door, and I have a private medical team keeping him sedated so he does not hurt anyone else. We will sit down together tomorrow and figure out a long-term rehabilitation plan. Just get here safely." "We will be there," Dad Derek promised, offering me a warm, reassuring smile that made my skin crawl. "Try to get some sleep. I love you." "I love you too," son. I lied smoothly and disconnected the call. The computer screen went completely black. I sat in the heavy silence of the study for 3 long seconds. I took a very slow, deep breath. Then the tired, vulnerable old grandfather completely vanished. I straightened my posture, pulling my shoulders back. I smoothed my suit, my jaw setting into a rigid, unforgiving line. The facade was officially over. I had successfully lulled my prey into a false sense of absolute security. Derek and Natalie were flying directly into my territory, convinced I was a gullible old man who would hand their victim right back to them. They thought they outsmarted the man who built $1 billion empire from nothing. They were about to learn a devastating lesson. I picked up my cell phone, bypassing corporate assistance, and dialed the private number of Thomas Wright, my fiercest attorney. We are going to wage an absolute war today. Thomas Wright arrived at my penthouse less than 40 minutes after I ended the call with my son. He did not come alone. Walking a few paces behind him was Robert Vance, a former federal agent who now ran the most discreet, ruthlessly efficient private investigation firm in the Midwest. Thomas was a man who understood the gravity of my tone. He did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. He walked straight into my expansive mahogany study, dropped a heavy leather briefcase onto the glass conference table, and immediately asked what we were hunting. I quickly laid out everything I had discovered. I explained the horrifying condition of my grandson, the undeniable toxicology report from Dr. Evans, and the staggering financial discrepancies involving the domestic shell company registered to my daughter-in-law. I watched the professional composure on Thomas' face harden into a mask of pure predatory focus. Robert immediately opened his encrypted laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he tapped into private databases and secure financial registries. I told them that the stolen tuition money was simply not enough to justify the immense legal risk of chaining a teenager to a radiator. Derek was playing a much larger game, and we needed to find the ultimate prize. Thomas agreed, suggesting we start by looking completely outside of my own financial ecosystem. He pointed out that if Derek was hiding a massive financial motive, it likely originated from a source I had absolutely no control over. The only logical place to start digging was the estate of Derek's late first wife, Leo's biological mother. She came from a wealthy family in her own right, and she had passed away under tragic circumstances when Leo was just a young boy. Robert initiated a deep dive into the probate records and the sealed financial archives of her family estate. The silence in the room was absolute, punctuated only by the rapid, rhythmic clicking of his keyboard and the distant hum of the city traffic far below. I paced the length of the study, my hands clasped tightly behind my back, feeling the heavy burden of every minute that passed. After 2 grueling hours of unearthing heavily protected legal documents and bypassing complex corporate firewalls, Robert suddenly stopped typing. He leaned closer to the glowing monitor, his eyes narrowing as he read through a dense, multi-page legal contract. He signaled for Thomas to come over and verify what he had just found. Thomas adjusted his glasses, leaning over the screen. A slow, chilling breath escaped the attorney's lips. He turned to look at me, the grim expression on his face confirming my worst fears. They had found the hidden motive. Thomas carefully turned the laptop around so I could read the screen myself. It was an irrevocable generation skipping trust fund established by Leo's maternal grandparents shortly after his mother passed away. The principal balance of the trust was exactly $5 million. It was completely untouched, gathering substantial interest over the last decade. The stipulations of the document were incredibly rigid. The entire $5 million was legally mandated to transfer directly into Leo's sole possession on the exact day of his 18th birthday. Derek had absolutely no legal authority to withdraw, invest, or manage a single penny of that money. He was entirely locked out of the fortune. However, Thomas pointed a steady finger at a buried, obscure legal clause tucked deep within the final pages of the trust agreement. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The clause detailed a specific, tragic contingency plan. It stated that if Leo were to be officially declared permanently mentally incapacitated by a board-certified psychiatric professional before his 18th birthday, he would be deemed legally unfit to inherit the fortune. In that specific scenario, the sole guardianship and full, unrestricted financial control of the entire $5 million trust would default directly to his surviving biological parent. The money would instantly belong to Derek. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their plan washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. The pieces of the nightmare finally locked together in a picture so horrific it defied human comprehension. Derek and Natalie were not just keeping Leo hidden to steal a few $100,000 in tuition money. They had been deliberately, methodically drugging him with heavy clinical sedatives for 3 entire years to actively destroy his cognitive functions. They were intentionally inducing a state of permanent brain damage. They chained him in a dark, toxic attic and pumped his young body full of tranquilizers so they could completely obliterate his mind. They needed him to fail a psychiatric evaluation. They needed a doctor to look at my grandson and declare him permanently lobotomized. It was a slow, agonizing execution of his intellect, all meticulously orchestrated, so my son could legally steal $5 million on the boy's 18th birthday. I felt a violent wave of nausea roll through my stomach. The absolute depravity of my own flesh and blood was staggering. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk to keep my hands from shaking. I looked at Thomas, my voice a hollow, dangerous whisper as I asked how close Leo was to turning 18. "He is 17 and a half," Thomas replied grimly. "They are running out of time. They have to formalize his incapacitation very soon to activate the default clause before his birthday." Suddenly, Robert interrupted us. While Thomas and I were reading the trust documents, Robert had deployed a tracking script to monitor the digital footprint of the domestic shell company Natalie used to hide the stolen tuition. Through that connection, he had managed to quietly breach the security of her personal email server. He rapidly clicked through a series of newly retrieved messages. Robert's fingers danced across the keyboard with the blistering speed and precision of a digital surgeon. He quietly explained that Natalie was not nearly as smart or careful as she thought she was. She had foolishly used the same unsecured residential IP address in Winnetka to log into both the LLC's illicit banking portal and her personal encrypted email server by exploiting a tiny vulnerability in their home network's firewall. The very security network I had personally paid to install. Robert created an invisible backdoor directly into her darkest digital secrets. The trove of data he unearthed was staggering and sickening. He did not just find the emails to the corrupt psychiatrist. He found a meticulously maintained hidden spreadsheet. Natalie had been keeping a precise daily inventory of Leo's medication dosages, tracking his tragic cognitive decline as coldly as a broker tracks a stock portfolio. There were actual calendar alerts set on her phone for his bad days, marking exactly when they needed to add an extra heavy link to the iron chain to keep him subdued. Most horrifying of all, Robert uncovered a hidden folder containing several drafted versions of a fake eulogy for Leo. They were actively preparing for the very real possibility that a lethal overdose might be easier to explain away than a failed psychiatric evaluation. "Mr. Harrison." Robert said, his voice laced with sudden acute urgency. "I just intercepted a highly encrypted email sent from Natalie's private account less than 20 minutes ago. It was sent while they were sitting in the airport lounge in Dubai." I stepped around the desk, standing directly behind Robert's chair to read the intercepted communication. The email was addressed to a private, extremely expensive psychiatric physician operating out of a discreet clinic in the northern suburbs. The subject line simply read, "Final evaluation confirmation." I read the body of the message, feeling a fresh surge of lethal adrenaline pump through my veins. Natalie was explicitly confirming a home visit for the very next morning. She wrote that the patient was experiencing severe, irreversible cognitive decline and required immediate legal documentation for permanent medical conservatorship. They were not waiting for the dust to settle. They were booking Leo's final incapacitation evaluation for tomorrow morning. I realized I had to act with absolute precision right now. I could not let them anywhere near my grandson ever again. The trap needed to be set immediately, and it had to be absolutely flawless. I turned to Thomas and Robert, my voice perfectly steady. "Gentlemen," I told them coldly, "we have less than 12 hours to prepare for a war. The monsters are finally coming straight home. The gravity of what we had just uncovered settled heavily over the mahogany study, suffocating the air in the room. We had less than 12 hours before my son and his wife landed in Chicago, bringing their twisted web of lies directly into my home. I looked at Thomas and Robert, seeing my own grim determination reflected perfectly in their sharp eyes. There was absolutely no time for hesitation, doubt, or grief. We were no longer dealing with a tragic family crisis or a simple misunderstanding. We were dealing with a highly calculated, premeditated crime, and I needed absolute, undeniable proof of their sinister intentions, caught clearly on tape. I instructed Robert to immediately mobilize his best covert surveillance team to the building. I wanted my entire penthouse wired with military-grade audio and visual recording equipment before the sun went down. Robert nodded sharply, pulling out his encrypted phone to make the necessary calls, while Thomas began drafting the emergency legal injunctions we would need the very moment the trap finally snapped shut. The clock was ticking relentlessly, and every single second mattered to the survival of my grandson. My primary concern was ensuring my grandson was completely removed from the blast radius of the impending confrontation. I could not risk Derek or Natalie laying another finger on him, nor could I risk them attempting to use him as psychological leverage once their horrific plan was exposed to the light. I turned to Thomas and asked him to secure an undisclosed, highly protected safe house far outside the city limits. Thomas assured me he had a private, heavily guarded property in the northern suburbs that was off the grid and perfectly secure. We walked quietly down the long hallway to the guest suite where Leo was still resting under the careful watch of my private medical team. The heavy sedatives were slowly flushing from his system, but he was still far too fragile to witness the brutal war I was about to wage against his father. I knelt quietly by his bed, gently brushing a warm hand over his sleeping form. I whispered a silent, fervent promise that the nightmare was finally over for good. The medical staff carefully transferred him to a discreet, unmarked transport vehicle waiting in the underground garage below. I watched the bright taillights disappear into the busy Chicago traffic, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of relief, knowing the boy was finally safe from their grasp. Within an hour, Robert and his elite surveillance team arrived at my penthouse disguised as routine building maintenance workers. They moved through the luxurious space with terrifying efficiency, functioning as a silent army of technicians armed with specialized invasive equipment. I directed them to exclusively target the 3 primary areas where Derek and Natalie would most likely convene and secretly plot their next moves. They installed high-definition micro-cameras inside the intricate crown molding of the expansive living room, perfectly angled to capture the main seating area without leaving any blind spots. They placed military-grade ambient microphones directly behind the imported marble backsplash in the gourmet kitchen, sensitive enough to easily pick up the faintest whisper over the low hum of the massive refrigerator. Finally, they focused their intense efforts on the luxurious guest suite, where my son and daughter-in-law would be staying for the night. Miniature wide-angle lenses were seamlessly embedded into the metallic ventilation grates, covering every square inch of the room without leaving a single visible trace of their physical presence. Once the sophisticated equipment was fully live and operational, Robert handed me a customized, highly secure tablet synced directly to the hidden feeds. The audio was shockingly crystal clear, and the digital video quality was flawless. We were absolutely ready to capture their every move and word. To complete the elaborate illusion, I urgently needed to ensure Derek and Natalie firmly believed Leo was still physically present in the penthouse and heavily sedated under my care. I walked deliberately into the now empty guest suite and gathered several thick down pillows from the expansive linen closet situated in the adjacent hallway. I carefully arranged the soft cushions under the thick weighted duvet on the large mahogany bed, meticulously shaping them to flawlessly mimic the physical contours of a sleeping teenager. I pulled the expensive woven blankets up incredibly high, leaving just enough dark shadow near the wooden headboard to make the deception completely convincing in the dim atmospheric lighting of the quiet room. I drew the heavy velvet blackout curtains tightly closed, blocking out the fading amber city light, and precisely adjusted the small bedside lamp to cast a soft, muted glow across the carefully constructed dummy. From the perspective of the open doorway, the visual illusion was absolutely perfect. It looked exactly like a deeply troubled boy quietly sleeping off a severe medical episode. I stepped completely out of the room, closing the heavy wooden door softly behind me, and walked back into the main living area. Robert and the dedicated tech team quickly packed up their remaining gear and quietly exited the penthouse, leaving me alone in the silent, heavily rigged apartment to patiently wait for the impending arrival of the predators. The evening sky over the sprawling, beautiful city of Chicago slowly bruised into deep, heavy shades of dark purple and black. I sat perfectly still in my favorite leather armchair, the secure surveillance tablet, resting face down on the glass coffee table right beside my reading glasses. The silence in the massive penthouse was incredibly heavy and deeply oppressive, thick with the agonizing anticipation of the coming storm. I closed my eyes and focused entirely on my breathing, meticulously constructing the impenetrable emotional armor I would desperately need to wear for the remainder of the long night. I had to firmly bury the furious, deeply betrayed father far inside my heart and completely embody the frail, overwhelmed, and gullible old man they fully expected to find, waiting for them. I needed to swallow my sickening disgust and welcome the ruthless monsters into my home with open arms and a weary, trusting smile. Every passing minute felt like an agonizing eternity ticking away in the darkness. I mentally reviewed the comprehensive plan one last time, ensuring there were absolutely no blind spots or lingering vulnerabilities in the elaborate trap I had so carefully set. The invisible, deadly snare was perfectly laid. The irresistible bait was fully set. All that remained was for the arrogant predators to confidently step inside. The digital clock, resting on the marble mantel, silently flipped to exactly 9 in the evening. At that precise defining moment, a soft, pleasant, melodic chime echoed sharply through the quiet, expansive foyer. It was the private, secure elevator signaling an unexpected arrival from the grand lobby below. The heavy, polished brass doors slid open with a quiet, steady, incredibly smooth hum. Confident, familiar footsteps echoed sharply against the cold, polished marble floor. Derek and Natalie had finally arrived at the penthouse, their faces perfectly arranged into carefully rehearsed, flawless masks of deep, highly convincing parental concern. As the elevator doors slid open, Derek immediately rushed into the expansive foyer. He dropped his leather bags onto the marble floor without hesitation. His face was a masterful canvas of manufactured agony. He sprinted across the living room and threw his arms tightly around my shoulders, burying his face against my neck. "Dad." He choked out, his voice cracking with a calculated sob. "I am so incredibly sorry we put you through this nightmare. We came back the second we could." Natalie was right behind him, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood. She wrapped her arms around my waist, pressing her cheek against my chest. "Oh, Bill," she wept, her voice trembling. "We have been completely out of our minds with worry for you." I stood there trapped in the suffocating embrace of the two monsters who were actively plotting my murder. Every single instinct screamed at me to push them away and scream the truth into their faces. Instead, I forced my muscles to relax. I let my shoulders slump forward deliberately, adopting the physical posture of a frail, overwhelmed man. I reached up and weakly patted my son. "It is all right, Derek," I whispered. "You are both here now." I slowly pulled away from their embrace, taking a deliberate, unsteady step backward. I raised my right hand and pressed it firmly against the center of my chest, closing my eyes and drawing in a sharp, ragged breath. Derek instantly reached out, gripping my elbow with feigned, desperate concern. "Dad, are you all right?" he asked, his eyes wide and scanning my face for any sign of genuine distress. "Your color is terrible. Should I call a doctor?" I shook my head slowly, letting out a long, weary sigh. "It is just my heart, son," I murmured, keeping my hand pressed over my sternum. The stress of the last 24 hours has taken a severe toll on me. Seeing Leo in such a violent state was simply too much for an old man to bear. I need to sit down before my blood pressure spikes. Derek gently guided me toward the plush sofa, his touch sending a sickening wave of revulsion straight through my veins. He was watching me clutch my chest, silently calculating exactly how fragile my cardiovascular system actually was. Once I was seated, Natalie knelt on the expensive rug right beside my knees. "Where is he, Bill?" she asked, her voice dropping to an anxious, urgent whisper. "We need to see him right now. We have specialized restraints in our luggage. If he wakes up and starts experiencing another psychotic break, we have to be fully prepared to lock him down before he hurts you." I slowly raised a trembling finger to my lips, signaling for absolute silence. I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a cautious, hushed tone. "You must keep your voices down," I warned them, gesturing vaguely down the long, shadowed hallway. "He had another massive, incredibly violent episode just 2 hours ago. He was thrashing around the room, smashing lamps and screaming absolutely nonsensical things. My private medical team had to rush in and physically pin him to the mattress. They administered a very heavy clinical dose of intravenous sedatives to finally calm his erratic heart rate. He is completely unconscious right now, and the head physician explicitly warned me that any sudden noise could easily trigger another dangerous seizure." Derek frowned deeply, exchanging a very quick, highly suspicious glance with his wife. "I need to see him with my own eyes." "Dad," he insisted, standing up and taking a step toward the hallway. "I need to make absolutely sure the doctors secured him properly." I nodded weakly, slowly pushing myself up from the sofa with a manufactured groan of physical effort. "I will show you," I whispered, "but you must not step foot inside the room. If he senses a shift in the air pressure, he might snap out of the chemically induced sleep." I led them silently down the thick, carpeted corridor. We stopped directly outside the heavy oak door of the primary guest suite. I reached out and turned the brass handle with agonizing slowness, pushing the door open just a few inches. The room was bathed in heavy shadows, illuminated only by the soft, amber glow of a single bedside lamp. I stepped aside, allowing Derek and Natalie to peer through the narrow gap. The thick, weighted duvet was pulled high over the meticulously arranged pillows, perfectly mimicking the shape of a deeply sleeping teenager. The illusion was absolutely flawless. Derek stared at the motionless lump for a long, agonizing moment. Finally, his tense shoulders relaxed. He slowly pulled the door shut until the latch clicked silently. "I is completely out. Cold," Derek whispered, turning back to face me with a look of profound relief. "The doctors must have given him a massive dose." I nodded, leaning heavily against the corridor wall for physical support. "They did what they had to do to keep him safe," I replied tiredly. "Now it is time for all of us to get some rest. You two have been traveling across the globe for 14 hours, and I am completely physically exhausted. I have prepared the secondary guest suite at the far opposite end of the penthouse for you both. It is completely isolated from this wing, so you will not be disturbed if the medical team needs to rush back in during the night. We will sit down in the morning and figure out exactly what to do." Natalie immediately wrapped her arm around her husband. "Thank you, Bill," she whispered softly. "Thank you for stepping in and saving our family." I watched them walk down the long hallway until they disappeared into the secondary suite and closed the heavy door. The exact second I heard the heavy deadbolt click into place at the end of the hall, the exhausted, fragile grandfather completely vanished from my posture. I stood perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders back to release the agonizing tension that had been building in my muscles for the last hour. My heart was pounding with a fierce, relentless rhythm, but my mind was incredibly sharp and deeply focused. I turned on my heel and walked briskly toward my master study. I stepped inside the quiet, oak-paneled room and firmly locked the door behind me, ensuring I was completely isolated from the rest of the sprawling penthouse. I walked over to the mahogany desk and sat down in the heavy leather chair. I reached out and picked up the customized secure surveillance tablet Robert had left for me. The digital screen illuminated my face with a cold blue light. I carefully slipped the high-fidelity, noise-canceling headphones over my ears and activated the live audio feed connected directly to the secondary guest suite. I sat perfectly still in the quiet darkness of the study, holding my breath, patiently waiting for their loving parental masks to finally slip completely off. I knew they could not hide their true monstrous nature from me for very long. Soon, the absolute truth of their betrayal would be recorded and preserved forever. Through the glowing high-definition screen of my surveillance tablet, the heavy mahogany door of the secondary guest suite clicked shut. The muted thud of the deadbolt sliding into its housing echoed through the noise-canceling headphones pressed against my ears. For a fleeting second, Derek and Natalie stood perfectly still in the center of the luxurious room. They faced the locked door, their shoulders slumped in a posture of manufactured exhaustion. Then, in the blink of an eye, the elaborate charade completely dissolved. The transformation was so instantaneous and absolute, it sent a fresh, icy wave of revulsion crashing through my veins. The sorrowful, weeping parents I had just comforted in my living room vanished into thin air. They were replaced by two cold, calculating strangers who looked like cornered predators calculating their next ruthless move. Natalie was the first to break the silence. She let out a sharp, frustrated hiss, tearing the expensive designer scarf from her neck and throwing it viciously onto the bed. She began to pace the length of the room with frantic, agitated steps. The thick carpet muffled the sound of her heels, but the sheer violent energy of her movements radiated clearly through the digital feed. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, digging her manicured fingernails into her own skin as she marched back and forth between the window and the fireplace. Her face, which just moments ago had been a masterpiece of maternal grief, was now twisted into a hideous mask of pure, unadulterated panic and furious indignation. I sat rigidly in the dark isolation of my master's study, my eyes locked on her pacing form. Every frantic turn she took felt like a physical strike against the lingering hope I had harbored that this might all be a terrible misunderstanding. The bitter reality of their deception tasted like ash in the back of my throat. For decades, I had tirelessly built a massive financial empire to shield my family from the cruel hardships of the world, unknowingly funding the very monsters who would seek to destroy it. I watched her breathe heavily, her chest heaving, as she muttered under her breath, her eyes darting nervously toward the locked door. She was terrified, but it was not the terror of a mother fearing for her sick child. It was the naked, desperate terror of a criminal who suddenly realized the walls were rapidly closing in around her carefully constructed heist. Derek, meanwhile, exhibited a level of calm that was profoundly far more terrifying than his wife's frantic pacing. He casually unbuttoned the top of his wrinkled linen shirt, rolling up his sleeves, with slow, deliberate, incredibly relaxed movements. He walked over to the elegant mirrored wet bar positioned in the corner of the guest suite. He did not look at his panicking wife. He did not spare a single glance toward the hallway where his supposedly violently ill son was resting. Instead, he reached out and selected a heavy crystal tumbler. He picked up a bottle of expensive scotch I kept for visiting executives and poured a drink. He did not flinch or ever rush his movements. He simply watched the golden liquid fill the heavy glass, utterly captivated by his own deeply disturbing sociopathic reflection. The sound of the glass against the bottle was perfectly captured by the military-grade microphones broadcasting directly into my ears. He took a slow sip of the amber liquid, closing his eyes for a moment, as if he were unwinding after a long day at the office. His sociopathic detachment was staggering. This was the man who had chained his own flesh and blood to an iron radiator in a toxic, soundproofed attic. This was the man who had just lied straight to my face while I clutched my chest in feigned cardiac distress. He was entirely unfazed by the destruction he was orchestrating. He was hollow inside. "This is a complete disaster, Derek." Natalie finally snapped her voice, dropping to a harsh, aggressive whisper that hissed violently through the sensitive audio feed. She stopped pacing and spun around to glare at her husband, throwing her hands up in the air. "We are completely out of time. If your dad brings his own team of private doctors to look at Leo tomorrow morning, they will run a comprehensive blood panel. They will know exactly what we have been doing. They will know we have been deliberately poisoning him for the last 3 years. The entire narrative will collapse in a matter of seconds." I squeezed my eyes shut, a sharp, agonizing pain blooming deep in my chest. Hearing the brutal, unvarnished truth spoken aloud by my own daughter-in-law was a deeply traumatic experience. The undeniable confirmation of the clinical poisoning was now permanently captured on a highly secure digital recording. There was no room for doubt. There was no alternative. They were systematically destroying my grandson's brain chemistry, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Natalie closed the distance between them, stepping directly into Derek's personal space. Her voice grew even more frantic, dripping with raw, unchecked greed. "Do you understand what is at stake here?" she demanded, her whisper echoing loudly in my headphones. "The $5 million trust fund is going to slip right through our fingers. We spent 3 miserable years locking that ungrateful brat in the dark, feeding him those pills, perfectly preparing him for the psychiatric evaluation. We were just days away from securing the legal incapacitation order. If your father figures this, not only do we lose the entire $5 million, but we are going to spend the rest of our natural lives rotting inside a federal penitentiary." I leaned closer to the illuminated screen of the tablet, my knuckles turning stark white as I gripped the heavy wooden edge of my mahogany desk. The recording was absolutely flawless. The audio capture of her explicit confession regarding the trust fund. The illegal confinement and the premeditated chemical lobotomy was robust enough to ensure neither of them would ever see the outside of a prison cell again. The snare had successfully tightened around their ankles. I had everything I needed to destroy them both legally and financially. Yet despite the overwhelming panic radiating from his wife, Derek remained chillingly serene. He took another slow, deliberate sip of the aged scotch, letting the amber liquid linger in his mouth before swallowing smoothly. He lowered the crystal tumbler and finally turned to look directly at Natalie. The expression on his face made the blood freeze completely solid in my veins. He was smiling. It was not a smile of reassurance or warmth. It was a cold, calculated, dead-eyed smirk that belonged on the face of a ruthless apex predator preparing to strike a fatal blow. Derek reached out with his free hand and gently tucked a stray strand of Natalie's hair behind her ear, a gesture of deeply unsettling manufactured affection. "You are panicking over absolutely nothing," he whispered back, his voice smooth, steady, and terrifyingly devoid of any human empathy. "You need to stop looking at the small picture. You are letting your anxiety blind you to the monumental opportunity sitting right outside that door." Natalie frowned, slapping his hand away from her face in sheer frustration. "What are you talking?" she hissed angrily. "How can you possibly be this calm right now? We are trapped in your father's penthouse, with a medical team breathing down our necks. Our entire plan is disintegrating in front of us." Derek let out a low, dark chuckle that vibrated through the microphones and settled like a heavy stone in the pit of my stomach. He took one step closer to her, his smile widening into something genuinely sinister. The dim amber light of the bedside lamp caught the cold, calculating glint in his eyes as he looked down at his trembling wife. "Forget the $5 million, Nat," Derek said softly, his tone dripping with a lethal, terrifying certainty that echoed relentlessly in the dark isolation of my study. "Why on earth would we settle for crumbs when we can easily have the whole bakery by tomorrow morning?" The first pale rays of the morning sun began to slowly pierce through the heavy dark clouds hanging over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The golden light spilled across the polished hardwood floors of my luxurious penthouse, illuminating the quiet, expansive living room in a soft, deceptively peaceful glow. I had not slept a single second. I had spent the entire night sitting perfectly still in my favorite leather armchair, the secure surveillance tablet resting coldly on the glass coffee table right beside my reading glasses. The horrifying, monstrous words my son had whispered to his wife in the dead of night continued to echo relentlessly through the hollow chambers of my exhausted mind. Why settle for crumbs when we can easily have the whole bakery by tomorrow morning? He was not just planning to permanently lobotomize my 16-year-old grandson to steal a $5 million trust fund. I was actively planning to murder me in cold blood, to inherit my entire $200 million real estate empire today. I sat perfectly rigid in the armchair, holding the morning edition of the financial newspaper in my trembling hands. I was not actually reading a single word printed on the broadsheet pages. My eyes were blindly scanning the black ink, while my mind meticulously reviewed the flawless, lethal trap I had set with my attorney and the federal authorities. Every single detail had been arranged with ruthless precision. I just needed to play the role of the frail, trusting, gullible old father for a few more excruciating minutes. The heavy silence of the penthouse felt incredibly thick and deeply oppressive, hanging in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. My chest ached with a profound, unbearable sorrow that I knew would haunt me for the rest of my natural life. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I had proudly watched graduate from college, the son I had unconditionally loved and financially supported for 4 decades, was currently in my kitchen, meticulously preparing a lethal dose of clinical sedatives to stop my beating heart. I sat entirely motionless in the leather armchair, watching the sprawling city of Chicago slowly wake up below me through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Millions of people were starting their normal mundane Tuesday routines, pouring out of train stations and buying coffee, completely unaware of the Shakespearean tragedy rapidly unfolding in the clouds above them. The stark contrast between the beautiful morning and the pure evil in my home was agonizing. I looked at the framed photographs lining the marble mantelpiece. There was an old faded picture of Derek at 7 years old, sitting happily on my broad shoulders at a summer baseball game, his face smeared with cotton candy and pure, innocent joy. I desperately tried to connect that laughing, bright-eyed child to the ruthless, calculating monster currently standing in my kitchen. Where had I gone wrong? Had my relentless pursuit of extreme wealth shielded him from the necessary hardships that build a man's moral compass? I realized with a heavy, sinking heart that the origin of his darkness no longer mattered. The time for parental introspection was over. I had to permanently bury the loving father and unleash the ruthless executioner. My survival and Leo's future depended entirely on my ability to look the devil in the eye without blinking. The faint melodic whistling of a boiling tea kettle drifted quietly down the long hallway, slicing through the heavy tension of the early morning. I tightened my grip on the crisp edges of the newspaper, forcing my breathing to remain slow, shallow, and perfectly measured. I could hear the soft, casual padding of his expensive leather loafers against the marble flooring as he made his way toward the main living area. He was walking with the relaxed, confident stride of a man who firmly believed he had already won the ultimate prize. The delicate, aromatic scent of bergamot and steeped black tea leaves preceded him into the room. It was my absolute favorite blend of Earl Grey tea, a specific morning tradition we had shared for many long, happy years before the dark rot of extreme greed had completely consumed his soul. Derek strolled casually into the sunlit living room, carrying a delicate porcelain teacup and saucer in his right hand. He was dressed in a crisp, freshly ironed button-down shirt and tailored slacks, looking the very picture of a polished, successful, and deeply caring son. A warm, incredibly affectionate smile was plastered effortlessly across his handsome face. It was a flawless, terrifying performance that chilled me to the very core of my being. I slowly lowered the newspaper to my lap, looking up at the monster wearing my son's familiar face. "Good morning, Dad," Derek said softly, his voice dripping with an artificial, sugary, sweet layer of manufactured sympathy and deep concern. "You are up awfully early today. I hope you managed to get at least a few hours of decent sleep after the terrible shock of yesterday. I know how heavily this entire devastating situation with Leo has been weighing on your weak heart." I did not smile back. I simply looked at him, letting the heavy, agonizing silence stretch between us for a long, uncomfortable moment. I wanted to see if I could detect even a microscopic fraction of guilt, hesitation, or human remorse hiding behind his bright, confident eyes. There was absolutely nothing. His gaze was entirely flat, cold, and utterly devoid of any genuine empathy or moral hesitation. He was completely hollow inside, a ruthless predator patiently waiting for his vulnerable prey to blindly consume the poison. "I made you a fresh cup of your favorite tea." Derek continued smoothly, stepping closer to the leather armchair and gently extending the steaming porcelain cup toward me. "Here you go, Dad. Drink up while it is still nice and hot. It has a special blend of soothing herbs in it. It will help you relax your nerves and calm your high blood pressure after all this terrible family stress. We have a very long, difficult day ahead of us with the doctors, and I need you to be completely calm and rested." I slowly reached out my right hand, allowing my fingers to tremble ever so slightly as I took the delicate porcelain saucer from his steady grip. The radiant, comforting warmth of the hot tea seeped directly through the thin ceramic, radiating gently against the cold, clammy skin of my palms. I stared deeply into the dark, swirling amber liquid inside the cup. It looked perfectly normal. It smelled exactly like the soothing, familiar Earl Grey tea I had consumed thousands of times before. But I knew the absolute, terrifying truth. Hidden seamlessly within that fragrant, steaming liquid was a massive, highly concentrated dose of the exact same clinical tranquilizers. They had been violently forcing down my grandson's throat for 3 years. It was a meticulously calculated lethal concoction explicitly designed to trigger a sudden, massive, and entirely natural-looking cardiac arrest in a 75-year-old man with a known history of mild cardiovascular issues. The sheer agonizing tension in the quiet living room was utterly suffocating. Derek took a deliberate half-step backward, crossing his arms casually over his chest as he stood over me. He was hovering, completely captivated by the moment, silently watching, and patiently waiting for me to raise the porcelain rim to my lips and take the fatal sip. He was waiting to watch my eyes roll back in my head. I was waiting to watch me slump lifelessly against the leather cushions so he could immediately seize complete control of my entire $200 million real estate empire and permanently lock his own teenage son inside a high-security psychiatric asylum forever. I held the warm, poisoned porcelain cup perfectly steady in my hands. I slowly raised my head, locking my cold eyes directly onto his. I did not blink at all. I let the facade of the exhausted, gullible grandfather completely evaporate. Very slowly, deliberately, and without ever breaking eye contact, I lowered the porcelain cup down to the heavy glass coffee table. Derek frowned slightly, a microscopic flicker of genuine confusion finally breaking through his perfectly polished, arrogant facade. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and stated, "I prefer my tea without a lethal dose of sedatives, Derek." Derek's smile vanished. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed my words felt as though the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the expansive living room. Derek stood perfectly frozen, his hand still hovering in the empty space between us, suspended over the glass coffee table where I had placed the porcelain teacup. The warm, arrogant, and comforting smile that had been plastered across his handsome face just seconds ago evaporated completely. It was replaced by a rigid, terrifying blankness. I watched the gears turning frantically behind his dark eyes as his calculating brain struggled to process what had just happened. He blinked rapidly, stepping back and letting out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that sounded completely hollow and unnatural in the quiet space. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Dad," he stammered, his voice cracking noticeably as he rubbed the back of his neck with a trembling hand. "You must still be exhausted from the stress of bringing Leo home last night. You are not making any sense right now. There is nothing but Earl Grey tea and a little bit of natural honey in that cup. I honestly made it for you myself today." I did not move a muscle. I remained seated in my heavy leather armchair, staring up at him with cold, unblinking focus. "Do not insult my intelligence, Derek," I said softly, my tone completely devoid of any parental warmth or hesitation. "The time for your elaborate, sickening performances has come to an end now." Just as the words left my mouth, the heavy oak doors swung open. Natalie padded softly into the living room wearing a silk robe. She stopped dead in her tracks the moment she crossed the threshold, instantly sensing the sharp, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. She looked from the untouched porcelain cup resting on the coffee table to her husband. His pale, sweating face told her everything, and finally she looked to me. Her eyes widened with sudden apprehension. "Derek, what is going on?" she asked, her voice tight with rising panic. "Why is he looking at you like that? Is something wrong with the tea?" Derek opened his mouth to formulate another desperate lie, but I did not give him the opportunity to speak. I reached into the deep pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out the small black remote control that operated the massive television mounted above the marble fireplace. I pressed the power button with a firm, deliberate motion. The large screen instantly flared to life, illuminating the tense room with a cold, pale blue glow. I did not need to explain anything to them. The evidence was about to speak for itself today. The screen displayed the crystal-clear night vision footage that Robert and his surveillance team had captured just a few hours ago inside the secondary guest suite. The camera angle was perfectly positioned, showing Derek and Natalie pacing furiously back and forth across the thick carpet. The ambient microphones broadcasted their hushed, frantic voices with terrifying clarity, echoing loudly off the high ceilings of my penthouse. The recording captured Natalie hissing about the $5 million trust fund slipping through their fingers. It captured her complaining bitterly about the 3 years they had spent locking Leo in the dark and forcing pills down his throat to orchestrate a permanent psychiatric incapacitation. I watched my son and daughter-in-law freeze in paralyzing horror as their own recorded voices filled the room. Natalie clutched her hands over her mouth, letting out a sharp, muffled gasp as she realized the sheer magnitude of their exposure. But the true devastating climax of the recording was still approaching. The video showed Derek casually pouring himself a glass of aged scotch at the wet bar, smiling with that dead, predatory look in his eyes. Then his chilling, sociopathic words blasted through the speakers directly. "Forget the $5 million, Nat. Why settle for crumbs when we can have the whole bakery by tomorrow morning? Dad has a weak heart. I will make him his favorite Earl Grey tea tomorrow morning and empty this vial into it. It will trigger a massive natural-looking cardiac arrest. With Dad dead, I immediately inherit his $200 million real estate empire. We lock Leo away in an asylum permanently, and no one will ever question us." I pressed the mute button, cutting off the audio, but leaving the damning image of Derek and his ruthless smile frozen on the massive screen. The quiet that descended upon the living room was absolute and incredibly heavy. Natalie began to shake violently, stepping backward until her spine hit the hallway wall. She could not tear her terrified gaze away from the television. Derek stood completely paralyzed, his chest heaving, as the inescapable reality of his situation finally crushed him. The crafted, flawless facade he had worn for decades was entirely obliterated in a matter of seconds. He looked down at the poisoned cup of tea resting on the glass coffee table. He knew that the amber liquid was the final, irrefutable piece of physical evidence required to secure a conviction for premeditated attempted murder. Survival instinct, raw and desperate, suddenly overrode his paralyzing shock. With a primal guttural roar, Derek lunged violently forward, throwing his entire body weight toward the heavy glass table. He reached out with both hands, his fingers stretched wide desperately, trying to grab the porcelain cup to smash it against the hardwood floor and destroy the toxic contents inside. He never even got close. Before his fingertips could brush the edge of the delicate saucer, the heavy reinforced mahogany doors of the penthouse kitchen, the main hallway, and the master bedroom burst open simultaneously with explosive, deafening force. A heavily armed tactical unit of federal agents swarmed directly into the living room, their tactical boots pounding violently against the polished floors. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." Nobody move! A commanding voice roared over the chaotic din. Keep your hands exactly where I can see them right now. Two massive agents intercepted Derek in mid-air. They grabbed him by the shoulders, using his own forward momentum to slam him brutally, face first onto the thick, expensive rug, missing the glass coffee table by mere inches. Derek let out a sharp, breathless gasp as all the air was forcefully expelled from his lungs. The harsh metallic clicking of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed sharply through the room. Natalie collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor in a hysterical, weeping heap. A female agent immediately hauled her back up to her feet, roughly securing her hands behind her back, while loudly and firmly reciting her legal rights. The chaos was absolutely deafening, a whirlwind of shouted commands and frantic crying. Thomas Wright walked calmly into the room, placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. "We finally got them, Bill," he stated quietly. I slowly stood up, looking down at my weeping son. The unyielding ice in my veins solidified. "You stopped being my son the moment you chained that innocent boy in the dark. 2 years have passed since that terrifying morning in my Chicago penthouse. The wheels of justice turned with a slow, but absolutely relentless and crushing efficiency. The sheer volume of undeniable physical and digital evidence we handed over to the federal authorities left my son and his wife with absolutely no room to maneuver or negotiate. The high-definition surveillance videos, the intercepted emails regarding the trust fund, the horrific toxicology reports detailing the heavy sedatives, and the physical chains we recovered from the soundproofed attic painted a picture of domestic terror so profound that it shocked even the most hardened federal prosecutors. Derek and Natalie attempted to turn on each other during the extensive legal proceedings, desperately trading accusations and trying to secure a reduced sentence, but their pathetic efforts were entirely useless. The judge presiding over the federal trial showed them absolutely zero leniency. They were both convicted on multiple severe felony charges, including premeditated attempted murder, aggravated child abuse, unlawful imprisonment, and massive financial fraud. They were each handed consecutive sentences totaling 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. I personally attended every single day of the grueling trial. I sat perfectly still in the front row of the courtroom, watching the man I had raised and loved unconditionally being physically led away in heavy steel shackles. When the head juror stood up to read the final verdict, the silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. I looked directly at Derek. I was wearing a standard-issue faded orange jumpsuit, a stark and humiliating contrast to the bespoke tailored designer suits he had proudly worn his entire life. His wrists, which once signed multi-million-dollar real estate contracts, were now chained heavily to the oak defense table. As the word guilty echoed through the high-ceilinged room time and time again for each consecutive felony charge, his manufactured arrogance finally and permanently broke. He slowly turned his head and locked eyes with me from across the wooden aisle. For a brief, pathetic moment, his pale lips trembled and he mouthed the word, "Dad," silently pleading for a miraculous last-minute rescue that he knew deep down was never coming. I did not blink, and I did not offer him a single ounce of sympathetic comfort. I simply turned my head away, coldly severing the invisible lifelong bond of fatherhood forever. Natalie, sitting just a few feet away, completely collapsed into her defense attorney's arms, sobbing uncontrollably as the judge struck the heavy wooden gavel. It was a sharp, undeniable sound of absolute justice violently closing the darkest, most painful chapter of our family's history. I felt a profound, heavy sorrow for the loss of my only child, but I felt absolutely no regret for putting him behind bars. My legal team, led by Thomas Wright, moved swiftly in family court to permanently strip Derek of all his parental rights and completely sever his legal ties to my $200 million real estate empire. He will absolutely never touch a single dime of my hard-earned money, and he will never be allowed to contact my grandson ever again. The dense concrete jungle of downtown Chicago felt incredibly suffocating after the traumatic events of that winter. I needed a completely different environment, a place where my grandson could breathe clean air and slowly rebuild his shattered life far away from the dark shadows of his past. I personally purchased a sprawling, sunlit equestrian ranch nestled in the quiet rolling hills of upstate Illinois. It is a beautiful, expansive property surrounded by miles of open green pastures and tall, ancient oak trees. Today, the horrific memories of that dark, toxic attic feel like a distant, fading nightmare. I am now the sole permanent legal guardian of Leo. Watching his remarkable recovery over the last 24 months has been the greatest, most profoundly rewarding experience of my entire 75 years on this earth. The heavily sedated, emaciated prisoner I found chained to a rusted iron radiator is completely gone. In his place stands a vibrant, healthy young man. Leo has gained 30 pounds of solid muscle. His skin has regained its natural, healthy color, and his dark eyes are incredibly bright and full of genuine, unrestrained joy. We spend our mornings walking together along the white wooden fences of the ranch, feeding the horses, and talking about the future. The psychological wounds were deep, and he required extensive, intensive therapy to process the trauma of his father's unimaginable betrayal. But his resilience is absolutely staggering. The journey back to himself was not a straight, easy line. There were terrible weeks when the phantom physical withdrawals would suddenly strike him in the middle of the night, leaving Leo shivering, sweating, and terrified, fully convinced he was back in that suffocating, dark attic. During those long, agonizing nights, I would sit in the wooden rocking chair by his bed, reading architectural history books out loud until his breathing finally steadied. The true turning point, however, did not happen in a therapist's office. It happened out in the sunlit stables with a massive rescue horse named Apollo. Apollo had been badly physically abused by his previous owners and was absolutely terrified of human touch. For weeks, Leo simply sat quietly in the dirt outside Apollo's stall, reading his books aloud, asking absolutely nothing of the frightened animal. Slowly, day by day, the two broken souls rebuilt each other's trust. The very first time Apollo willingly walked over, lowered his head, and rested it gently on Leo's shoulder, my grandson broke down into heavy, healing, cathartic tears. It was the exact moment the invisible iron chains in his mind finally snapped. He learned that severe trauma does not have to be a permanent prison, and that broken things can be made whole again with patience and love. He is currently sitting at the large oak dining table in our farmhouse, completely surrounded by heavy, thick textbooks and practice tests. He is diligently preparing for his college entrance examinations. He genuinely wants to study clinical psychology next year, so he can eventually help other vulnerable teenagers navigate severe trauma. Whenever I look at him, I see the absolute best parts of his late mother, and I am filled with an overwhelming sense of pride and immense gratitude. While Leo focused entirely on his personal healing and academic future, I turned my attention back to the massive corporate empire I had spent 50 years building. The terrifying ordeal with my son forced me to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about wealth legacy and the true meaning of family security. I realized that hoarding hundreds of millions of dollars in offshore accounts and commercial real estate portfolios meant absolutely nothing if the people closest to you lacked basic moral integrity. I completely restructured my entire holding company from the ground up. I stepped down from my rigorous daily duties as the chief executive officer, appointing a trusted, highly vetted board of directors to manage the commercial developments and skyscraper acquisitions. I took a massive portion of my personal liquid wealth and funneled it directly into a newly established philanthropic organization. I named it the Harrison Foundation for Vulnerable Youth. We created a highly specialized, well-funded legal and medical task force explicitly dedicated to identifying and rescuing minors who are trapped in situations of severe domestic financial abuse. We provide immediate secure housing, top-tier medical rehabilitation, and ruthless legal representation for children whose trust funds or inheritances make them prime targets for greedy predatory relatives. My wealth is no longer just a tool for accumulating more concrete and steel. It has become a powerful protective shield for the innocent and defenseless. Every time our foundation successfully removes a child from a toxic, abusive household and secures their stolen future, I feel a small piece of the heavy, lingering darkness in my own heart dissolve. My legacy will not be defined by the son who attempted to murder me for my fortune. It will be defined by the countless lives we are actively saving today. I spend my evenings sitting on the wide wrap-around porch of our farmhouse, watching the golden sun slowly dip below the sprawling green horizon. The air out here is incredibly crisp and pure, filled with the gentle sounds of the grazing horses and the soft rustling of the wind through the tall grass. I take a slow sip of my freshly brewed Earl Grey tea, no longer fearing the hidden contents of my own cup. The profound, suffocating anxiety that used to grip my chest every single day has entirely evaporated. I have found a deep, lasting peace that I never thought I would experience again. The winding road to this beautiful sunlit ranch was paved with unimaginable pain, deception, and the total destruction of my immediate family. I had to face the ultimate horrifying betrayal and make the agonizing decision to lock my only living son inside a federal cage. But looking back at everything that happened, I know with absolute certainty that I made the only correct choice. I chose the innocent victim over the guilty predator. I chose the painful, undeniable truth over a comfortable, deadly lie. The storm that ripped through my life destroyed the fragile, rotten foundation of my past, but it cleared the way for something incredibly beautiful and resilient to grow in its place. My beloved grandson is safe, my vast empire is serving a truly noble purpose, and my soul is finally at rest. As I watch Leo step out onto the wooden porch to join me carrying 2 large plates of warm dinner, I know, deep down inside, that our family future is wonderfully bright today. Family is often considered our safest harbor, but blood alone does not guarantee loyalty or morality. When you spend your life building an empire and providing for your children, it is incredibly easy to be blinded by unconditional love. However, boundless generosity, without strict oversight, can easily breed catastrophic entitlement and greed. You must never ignore your sharp intuition when a situation feels wrong, even if the hidden truth threatens to shatter your heart. True wisdom in your twilight years is not just about protecting your physical legacy. It is having the absolute courage to cut out the pure evil. If this story of betrayal and justice resonated with you, please hit that like button to support my fierce fight. Subscribe to our channel today to never miss a thrilling life story. Tell me below in the comments, where are you watching from today and what time is it now?